my name is Isabel Hemmings. I'm one of the trustees for the ME and fibromyalgia group in Sheffield, and I'm going to talk to you today about nutrition, but it's a pretty general talk about nutrition. I'll get that up in just a moment. So as I say, so my name is Isabel, and I'm a nutritional therapist. I'm currently doing a master's in nutritional therapy, but I'm a qualified nutritional therapist at the moment. What I want to talk to you about today is a very broad sort of picture about where we are with nutrition, and you know what we need to do, I suppose, going forward. Sorry, I'll go through a summary of what we're going to talk about in a moment, but just to say a little bit more about my background. I'm a nutritional therapist, and a nutritional therapist is somebody who looks at providing a nutritional assessment and providing nutritional support to people, but on a very individualized basis. So nutritional therapy, there's a sort of I suppose a recognition that nobody is the same as somebody else, and we shouldn't be using a one-size-fits-all. So nutritional therapy tries to look at each individually separately, and to look to identify the imbalances that might be causing a problem with somebody in terms of their own health, and try to address those imbalances. Nutritional therapy is a complementary medicine, and it's regulated in law by the CNHC. It generally deals with supporting people with chronic conditions and also looking to help people maintain good health as well. It's not treatment in that it's not a replacement for medical advice, and any problems that are of concern, any red flags need to be identified with the relevant doctor. And the professional organisation for nutritional therapists, the main one is called MBANT. So that's just a little bit about me. I'll quickly move on. So in terms of what I'll run through today, I want to talk about nutrition broadly and what we've seen in recent decades by way of the problems that we've seen emerging with diet and with health. And then I'll talk a little bit about some controversies in nutrition, which I'm sure will be familiar to you. And then I'll raise some questions about, or some suggestions about how we might go about reducing inflammation, improving digestive health, and then a very sort of broad brush approach to where we should be perhaps spending, how we should be eating in the future, so going forward. So I won't spend time on this. Nutrition clearly is about food and its relationship to health. That's what we will be talking about. And a balanced diet is described there as something which provides a variety of foods in such quantities and proportions that the need for energy, amino acids, vitamins, minerals, fats, carbohydrates, and other nutrients is adequately met for maintaining health, vitality, and general well-being, and also making a small provision for extra nutrients so that we are able to get by if we have times when we don't have a very balanced diet. So, key nutrients, again, this will be familiar to you all, I'm sure. Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are the main macronutrients. And then we also have the micronutrients, which are vitamins, minerals, and the things that we need in smaller quantities to keep us healthy. And then water. And the only thing I'll say about water today is that we roughly need 1.5 to 2 litres of fluids every day to keep us healthy. So that's I will say no more about water. Just to say a tiny bit about each of those macronutrients. So carbohydrates are primarily used for energy, for the muscles, for brains, for the nervous system. And they're actually the one macronutrient that are not regarded as essential, because you can live without them, as long as you have enough protein and fat. Carbohydrates are, broadly speaking, they're sugars. So simple carbohydrates are sugar, glucose, fructose, and then maltose, lactose, and sucrose. Sorry. And then the complex carbohydrates include things like starches and fibers, which we also use for our digestive system. Moving on to proteins. Now, protein is really important, as I'm sure you know. Everybody has to have proteins. Amino acids that we get from proteins, proteins broken down into amino acids, are essential for life. They're essential for our bones, our hair, our connective tissue, producing hormones, neurotransmitters, making enzymes, and they are really critical for our health. And there are 9 amino acids which are regarded as essential that you just have to have. You can't live without them. And protein is also used for providing energy. Moving on to fats. Now, fatty acids are also broken down to use for energy, and they're really important. Everybody needs fats in their diet. You need it for your brain, for brain development, for cells, for cell membranes. You need fat for the absorption of certain vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So if you were eating, you might be eating lots of greens and thinking, I'm getting lots and lots of lovely vitamin K, but unless you have the green vegetables with fat, you won't be able to absorb that vitamin. So the fat vitamins, really do need to be eaten with fat. The other thing to say about fats is that we need to have 2 essential polyunsaturated fatty acids in our diet. So those are the omega-3s and the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And in many countries, including the UK, the omega-3 fatty acids are not eaten enough. We don't get enough of them. You get them from fatty fish, and you also get them in a number of seeds and so on. But quite often what happens in today's day and age is that we have too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s. And omega-6s are quite inflammatory, and omega-3s are anti-inflammatory in the main. So what we say is that it's important to try and get the ratio between 3s and 6s right, so that you're having more of you're having essentially a closer ratio of 3s to 6s. So it's more like 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. Quite often it's 1 to 20. So the 6s are much more frequently taken in the diet. We also need clearly vitamins, the fat-soluble and the water-soluble vitamins, and a lot of minerals as well. Now, I'll come back to vitamins and minerals and those nutrients a little bit later on. Want to just move on to talk about where we are, what the problems are that we have with diet and health at the moment. And I'll just do a whistle-stop tour through some of this. So, over the last few decades, really, what we've seen is a move away from real food, nutrient-dense real food, to obviously a lot of processed foods, and that's caused us problems basically. So, ultra-processed food, which we've seen so much of, as basically as edible, as Michael Pollan says, they're edible food-like substances rather than real foods. They contain a lot of chemicals, colorings, preservatives, lots of sugar and not very nice fats and so on. So not good. And over the last 30 years or so, 20, 30 years, we've seen a 3-fold increase in people eating these foods in the Western world. And eating those ultra-processed foods has been associated through research with a number of diseases: obesity, cancer, coronary heart disease, diabetes, and independently, the amount of ultra-processed food that's eaten in a diet is independently linked to mortality rates as well. So those are the references for you there if you wanted to look those up. In the UK, pretty much half the food that's eaten now is ultra-processed. We are pretty much the worst, one of the worst in Europe. So here we are. This is from a piece of a study looking at obesity versus the availability of ultra-processed foods. And you'll see that in the UK, it's right up here in the top right-hand corner, saying we have a high level of obesity and a very high level of consumption of ultra-processed foods. So that's not a very good place for us to be in, really. Again, in terms of obesity, we have a situation now in this country, this data from May this year, where basically 67% of men, 60% of women in this country are either overweight or obese. And that includes 26% of men, 29% of women who are obese, and 20% of school age, year 6 age children were classified as obese. So it's not looking good. And this is really interesting, I think. This shows the change in the BMI, the body mass index in the UK between 1972 and 2016. And if you look at going back to 1972, at that point, 23% of men were overweight and only 2.7% of men were obese. And similarly with women, only 13.9 were overweight and 2.7 were obese. Now you'll see that for both men and women, the rates now are vastly different. So these changes, I think we forget, have happened really very, very recently. And, you know, there's a very significant changes to just the way we all are. Dietary risks are very much associated with disease. So 12.4% of the global burden of disease is linked to diet, and high BMI is another 8.6%. And over the last few decades, we've seen a huge rise in chronic disease, with 50% of global disease now being due to these what they call non-communicable diseases. So they're not infectious diseases, they're chronic diseases like cancer, cardiovascular disease, and so on. Sorry, this is rather not very good news. I'm sorry to be going through these rather miserable facts, but so in the UK, this is a chart to show the change in the rates of diabetes in both the UK and the USA since 1980. And as you can see, huge rise from less than 1% right through to, less than 1 million to right through to nearly getting, well, it's actually 4.7 million in the UK who have diabetes. And then again, since, this is the US, but since 1958, again, there's been a huge rise in the number of people with diabetes. And this is just to show an example from Wales, in fact, where you'll see the rise in chronic diseases, even since the beginning of the 2000s, has risen hugely just in those few, in a couple of decades, really, less than that, 15 years, really. So the impact of those dietary changes, there's a couple of particular areas I want to talk about in terms of those changes. And the first is around metabolic health concerns, and then I want to talk about nutrient deficiency. So I think probably people will be aware that quite often before people get type 2 diabetes, they get something called pre-diabetes or insulin resistance. And this is where, when you eat carbohydrates, you have a rise in blood sugar, and that requires a rise in insulin, because insulin is the hormone which helps to take sugar from your blood and put it in your cells. So what happens over time, if you have a high carbohydrate diet particularly, or if you have dysregulation of your blood sugar, what happens is that the insulin required to get the blood sugar back to balance and that sugar back into the cells, or into the cells where it's needed for energy, eventually you need to have more and more insulin released to get the same blood sugar into your cells. And where a situation where you have to have more and more insulin to get the sugar into your cells is called insulin resistance. So it's where the body is failing to properly regulate the blood sugar in your, the sugar in your blood. So eventually you get more and more insulin released, and eventually the body can't get the sugar level back to where it needs to be, and that's called type 2 diabetes. So that's when you need to have medication to resolve and to manage your blood sugar levels. And as you'll see, of those 3 macronutrients I talked about before, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats, the blood sugar levels rise particularly when you eat carbohydrates, less so when you eat protein, and very little, well, you don't rise at all when you eat fat. But what happens quite often, and particularly when you have pre-diabetes, is that you have a high spike in your glucose levels in your blood, particularly if it's very refined carbohydrate that you're eating or very sugary things. You then have to have this hike in your insulin levels to deal with that sugar, get it into your cells. And then the insulin, which is a fat storage hormone, then leads your food to be stored, if you like. You then also get what's called a glucose crash after you've had that spike. When it comes down again, it generally goes down below the normal level. And that glucose crash leads people to become hungrier again. So you've got these peaks and troughs of your blood sugar, up and down, which is not good for you. It causes more hunger and it causes more fat storage. Leading on from that, there are a number of other associated risks that come with blood sugar imbalance, and that's called the metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome increases your risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke and type 2 diabetes. It increases your risk of type 2 diabetes by 5 times. And a whole lot of other diseases are increased in risk. And 1 in 3 adults in the UK over the age of 50 has metabolic syndrome. It's defined by having, first of all, a larger waist size. So central obesity is a feature of this syndrome. And then 2 or more of the following specific other measures. So blood sugar being over 5.6 millimoles per litre, or having diabetes, and then having low HDL, which is the good cholesterol, having higher triglycerides, or having a high blood pressure. So you need 2 of those other ones alongside the central obesity. And that those measures for central obesity are actually not that high. So that's quite important to consider. And the point about waist circumference, I think, has in recent times has become more and more important, because there's more evidence that it's associated with metabolic imbalance. And as I say, this article shows waist circumference to be a predictor of cardiometabolic health in young adults in this one. And then in this paper, waist circumference is being independently and strongly associated with type 2 diabetes, especially in women. So if you're just going to measure one thing, measuring waist circumference is really important in terms of looking at risk of metabolic health problems. I do think that's something that people don't know very much, and I do think it would be great if more people were aware of that importance, the importance of waist circumference. As you'll have heard, metabolic health has been implicated in risk for COVID, and particularly for Black and ethnic minority groups, where the metabolic health is seen to be quite a major contributor to COVID risk. So I'll move on from metabolic health for the moment, and I just want to talk about nutrient deficiency in terms of the kind of diets that people eat at this point. So in addition to there being issues to do with people being obese and overweight, at the same time as being overweight, they can also be nutrient deficient. And this is really because quite a lot of diets aren't very high quality, and they're lacking density in terms of nutrient value of food. Obviously, healthy foods can cost more, and we do live in a very poor food environment. It is, you look everywhere you look, there's chocolate, there's buns, there's starchy foods. So we're all faced with it all the time. And clearly, you know, it's quite difficult sometimes to buy good food. Sedentary lifestyles clearly contribute, lack of exercise and stress. Basically our diet having got worse, we've also had more deficiencies in terms of the nutrients that we want to have in our diet. Nutrients, really, the deficiencies in key nutrients also contributes to chronic disease. And I've just put some examples there about, you know, some of the vitamins and nutrients that we need and how they contribute to a number of those chronic health problems like cardiovascular disease, metabolic health, depression, and so on. So we really do need, or those are just some examples, but we really do need our nutrients and those key vitamins and minerals. Again, just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of how we're doing in terms of the UK. So we have what's called a national diet and nutrition survey that's been happening over the last 9 to 10 years, which looks at what people are eating, but it also studies, takes samples of people's blood, so it can also look at nutrients and the sort of deficiencies, if you like, in terms of serum levels of certain nutrients. And what they've been doing year after year is taking this data and then they analyze it. And the latest analysis has shown that over the last 10 years, there's been no improvement in the fruit and vegetable consumption of people in this country. We've reduced our fibre intake, which isn't a good thing. I'll come back to that in a bit. We've had a little bit of a reduction in sugar intake, which is good. But most micronutrients across all age groups have reduced. Moving on to some of the key micronutrients that have got worse in terms of the diet that we're eating. So those are some of the vitamins that have where we're clearly reducing our intake. Just want to say a little bit about vitamin D, because again, I think most people will have heard of the importance of vitamin D for the immune system and for protection against COVID, or being able to cope with COVID if we do get it. This latest survey has found that basically 37% of children in this country are having less than what is a very minimal level of 25 nanomoles per litre. And 29% of adults are in the same boat. Now, if you have a vitamin D test, they will tell you that you're looking to have a level above 50 nanomoles per litre. And actually the desirable level is around over 100 nanomoles per litre. So you can see we've got a big problem in this country, and clearly we don't have a lot of sunshine in the winter, and we have to take supplements of vitamin D in order to have sufficient. But I think I would recommend people do get tested for vitamin D blood levels, because you can do something about it if your levels are low, and I would advise people to do that. On the micronutrients more generally, there are two groups of people that I think are more at risk from what we can see in terms of the deficiency levels. One are the older adults, older people over 65, the levels of deficiency have got worse. And then young females, young girls are again very low. And I'll just say a little bit more about that. So this is a chart showing over the 10-year period, really, the level to which young girls, females under 18, are not having enough of those vitamins or minerals. So this is a percentage below what is called the LRNI, and that is it's a deficient level. the LRNI is a deficient level, and anything below that is very deficient. And what you'll see from this, that over even just the last 10 years, things were bad, 10 years ago, but things are, substantially worse now, in particularly that 11 to 18-year-old age group. And clearly, in some cases also older women who are in the mid-range, and also older women. So those are quite concerning. But the reason why I particularly point out the young girls is that, clearly these are people who are growing up and who would be expecting to have children probably in a few years' time. If you're that deficient before you become pregnant, then that could be a problem for you and your baby's health. So, these are really quite important issues. This is a chart to show folate levels. This is blood folate levels, and again, you can see from that chart how things have got worse, particularly the young girls again, but others as well. And folate, as you know, is a really important substance, particularly if you are going to conceive a child. It's very important. So, having moved swiftly through that, I just want to say a little bit about food controversies, and particularly in relation to two areas, fat and carbohydrate. I think probably most people will be aware there's been lots of discussion all over the media, all over everywhere, about what we should all be doing with regards to fat and carbohydrate. And in the last couple of years particularly, there's been substantial debate. This paper here is one which the BMJ gathered together lots of different thinkers to try to get a consensus around various issues, and this is actually quite a good paper, which I will refer to. Going back to the 1950s and 60s, there was the diet heart hypothesis was developed by somebody called Ansel Keys, who said that dietary fat increased cholesterol levels, and that led to heart disease, basically. Later that changed to saturated fats, led to heart disease and should be replaced by polyunsaturated fats. But actually, there's no evidence that changing fat content of diet results in lowering of cholesterol or what are called the bad LDL cholesterol levels. And in fact, over 80% of those who develop heart disease have evidence of underlying insulin resistance, suggesting that in fact the metabolic health issues that I mentioned earlier are really what is underlying the heart disease issues that we're seeing in terms of that set of risks. Earlier back in the 60s and 70s, there was controversy, what's worse? Is it fat? Is it sugar? And in fact, fat won the day in terms of being to blame for health problems at that point. And yet clearly now there's an awful lot of evidence suggesting otherwise. So there's a big study done called the PURE study just recently. This was published in 2017. And this looked at 135,000 people in 18 countries. And they concluded, this is an epidemiological study, so it's looking at big numbers and big information about diet. And it concluded that high fat intake, total fat intake, and high saturated fat were associated with lower total mortality. So high fat or saturated fat associated with lower mortality levels. And they found that fat was not associated with cardiovascular disease. And they also found that saturated fat was actually inversely related to the risk of stroke. So it actually protects people from stroke. And that they also found that higher carbohydrate intake was associated with higher rates of mortality. So completely the opposite from what people had been told previously. And then this is a study which has come out, a review which has come out, in fact, just in the last few months. And this is published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, which is the big cardiology medical journal, if you like, and very prestigious. And these are all the big names involved in cardiology in the United States. And they're saying, again, clearly that saturated fats are not do not lead to increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and they also found that saturated fats were protective against stroke. And you'll see a nice quote there, which is, whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat and dark chocolate are foods which are not associated with cardiovascular risk. So we can all eat our dark chocolate without any sense of guilt. This is just a picture taken from a paper written by Asim Malhotra recently, which shows again that it is really probably the metabolic health issues which are causing the cardiac health, the coronary heart disease problems, and suggesting that diet is really important for preventing those problems. Sorry, excuse me. Just rushing on. This is another article which was featured in the BMJ fairly recently. And when it comes to carbohydrate, again, lots of people saying, should we eat carbohydrate? Should we have low carbohydrate? And so on. This piece of work, this is a review of carbohydrates. And what they concluded was really it's the type of carbohydrate which is important. And eating refined grains, potatoes, sugar-sweetened beverages are associated with increased risk of chronic disease, whilst if you have minimally processed grains and legumes and whole fruits, there's less risk around chronic disease, so they're much more healthy for you. I would like to just mention the glycemic index, because you might know that carbohydrates can be classified by their glycemic, what's called the glycemic index, which is basically measuring the effect that that particular food has on the blood glucose levels and how high your glucose spikes when you eat that food. And the glycemic load refers to the amount of carbohydrate in a particular serving of that food. So the higher the GI, glycemic index, or the glycemic load is that you're eating, the greater the risk for type 2 diabetes. So if you eat some carbohydrates, you might get a spike, but it's quite a low spike, and that's not such a risk. If you have a high spike, then that's much more risky in terms of the potential development of insulin resistance and diabetes. This is a chart which basically shows you when you convert particular foods, the carbohydrates in those foods into sugar, into teaspoons of sugar. This is a doctor who's come up with this way of demonstrating it. The equivalent, how many spoonfuls of sugar that would represent, how many teaspoons of sugar would it represent? So basmati rice, if you have a serving of 150 grams, it actually is equivalent to 10 teaspoonsful of sugar. However, if you have broccoli, then you'd have pretty much no teaspoonsfuls of sugar, or eggs. So you can see there's a lot of variation in terms of how much carbohydrate is in different foods, which is quite important. I just want to run on through a couple of things around the kind of changes we can make to our diets which help with reducing inflammation, and then also to talk about digestive health for a moment. So reducing inflammation, inflammation is a good thing in the human body, in that when you have an injury or an illness, normally the process which is inflammation can be very helpful to help you to repair. However, what happens in long-term chronic diseases is that you get a chronic inflammation, a low-grade chronic inflammation, which is actually helping to drive and continue that chronic disease, and that's not good. And then the fatigue that people get with chronic disease, including ME, is considered to be related to that pro-inflammatory status. So that's what's sort of contributing to the fatigue. And oxidative stress, which is also very much sort of goes alongside inflammation, occurs when there's an imbalance between the reactive oxygen species that you get produced all the time in your body and what are the radical scavengers that are supposed to mop up those ROSs. some of the vitamins that we talked about, like vitamin C and so on, they help to mop up the reactive oxygen species. So when it comes to diet, there are a number of things that the evidence seems to suggest we can be doing to help to keep that inflammation down in our diet. So you'll probably all be aware of the fact that the Mediterranean diet, which is one which is rich in fruits and vegetables, olive oil, legumes, nuts, fish, lean meat, a little bit of red wine, but with a low intake of sugar particularly, that diet is considered to be anti-inflammatory, and there was a very big study called the Probiotics study, which showed that it was associated with a significant reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. Really, there's a lot of evidence to support that being a good way of eating. And linked to that, there's another diet called the fatigue reduction diet, which is really pretty similar to the Mediterranean diet. But the research in terms of that diet, lots of leafy vegetables, tomatoes, as well as whole grains and fatty fish and so on, they found there's evidence that led to having a diet like that led to a reduction in the fatigue that is associated with breast cancer survivors, the kind of fatigue that they have, which is related to inflammation. So again, strong evidence to suggest that eating in that way, and again with low levels of refined foods and sugars, is really helpful for reducing inflammation. There have been a number of studies to show that the omega-3 fatty acids have anti-inflammatory properties that I mentioned earlier on. So eating a lot of fatty fish, but also you can get omega-3s particularly in flaxseed and chia seed and a number of other things. Trying to get your intake of omega-3 fatty acids is very, very good for reducing inflammation in the body. And then plant polyphenols. Now, polyphenols are protective substances that plants produce that are thought to have antioxidant properties. And studies taken place, like the very big Molly Sani study, have found that the greater the intake of these polyphenols, the lower the amount of inflammation in the body. So again, that's very important. And specifically, there's a polyphenol called isoquercetin, which is found in grapes and red onions, broccoli, raspberries, things like that. Those polyphenols were also found to reduce fatigue in cancer patients. And another one, the EGCG, which is found in green tea, is very good at reducing inflammation and fatigue. And that's been shown in studies in animal studies. They've not been replicated in humans at this stage, but still, it's worth thinking about. And then turmeric is been also shown by many studies. So a systematic review and a meta-analysis of a lot of different studies has shown that it significantly reduces markers of inflammation. So that's, again, a very helpful food to be looking at. Those are the references for that last slide. Just very quickly moving on to digestive health. Many people in the population, it's estimated 10 to 20% of the population have irritable bowel syndrome. And in ME and fibromyalgia, IBS is extremely common over the lifetime. Now, IBS and food sensitivities are generally associated with intestinal permeability, or what we call leaky gut. Now, this diagram at the bottom shows you the leaky gut. We have a gut lining which has a mucosal barrier, like a layer of mucus, which is it's very, very clever, and it helps us to digest and absorb nutrients that we need, whilst also keeping out pathogens and toxins. That's how it's supposed to work. It's got this epithelial layer to help us to do that. So we normally have these what are called tight junctions. But when we get inflammation, or when we have other damage to the gut lining, that then damages the tight junctions, which allows pathogens and toxins and other things to get through a layer that would not normally expect, to have those things go through. So normally it's nice and tight, and that gets damaged. So that's a big problem that we have. And leaky gut is a specific risk for autoimmune diseases, and many diseases can arise or be made worse because of leaky gut, including autoimmune diseases such as inflammatory bowel, celiac, multiple sclerosis and lupus, but also could well be that is the gut is implicated in ME as well. Factors that can affect gut permeability include obviously diet, alcohol, and then a disturbance of the microbiome, or the bacteria that live in your gut. We've all got huge quantities of bacteria in our gut, and it's about the balance of the different bacteria, which is so important. If you get the bacteria, so you have more of the bad bacteria and fewer of the good bacteria in your gut, then that's called dysbiosis, and that can occur as a result of a number of factors such as diet, but also stress can affect it, infections can affect it, and medications can affect your microbiome as well. So the kind of approaches that we can use to improve digestive health, certainly the kind of dietary patterns that we've looked at in terms of the Mediterranean diet and getting rid of sugar, getting rid of refined carbohydrates and those ultra-processed foods, really important for the gut bacteria. Then also a low fiber diet is also associated with dysbiosis of the gut. And a meta-analysis which was done recently showed that the health benefits of having a high fiber diet. Probiotics have been useful for many conditions. So probiotics support the microbiome in the gut to be more well balanced and more healthy. Now, whilst there's been a number of studies about probiotics in ME, and they've been shown to improve symptoms of IBS in ME, they haven't actually shown very much else in terms of wider benefit. However, I do think that probiotics, the kind of food probiotics that you can have, like yogurt and kefir and lots of fiber in your diet, I think are likely to be very beneficial for your gut health generally. And when it comes to dietary fiber, we should be getting 30 grams of fiber per day, and that's what's regarded as a healthy level. So when you can get fiber from lots of things, including dark chocolate, which is good, and nuts and seeds and so on. But actually, the ones that are really good are chia seeds, flax seeds, and pumpkin seeds, and sesame seeds are very good too. So we have to try quite hard to get that level of fiber, and quite often a normal diet wouldn't necessarily give you sufficient. So you have to try quite hard to get that level of fiber up in your diet. So just in conclusion, what should we eat? I think eating real food, and preferably food that's cooked from scratch, is really, really important for everybody. Whether you have a chronic health condition or you don't, it's just really, really important. And eating nutritionally dense food is just, your body needs all those vitamins and minerals. It needs the amino acids and the essential fatty acids. It can't function without them, or it makes you ill if you don't have them. And we need to have healthy fats. I think too much in the past, because we've all thought, oh, low fat, we shouldn't eat fat. People have avoided eating what are regarded really are essential fats in our diet, like the really good fats like olive oil, oily fish, nuts, dairy. I would advise not to eat trans fats, which you can get in very processed foods, and also the industrial fats like the highly processed vegetable oils, which are they're not good for you. having a variety in your diet is really, really important. So making sure that you get a huge range, as many different foods in your diet as you possibly can, so that you get, so that's really good for your microbiome, but also it gives you the range of nutrients that you need if you get a good range. And I would say, if you can, don't forget traditional foods. The most nutritionally dense foods you can get are actually organ meats. So eating, people don't necessarily always like liver, you used to get it at school, but actually it's a really, really nutrient dense food. It's really, really good for you. And bone broths, boiling up the chicken carcass at the end of a meal, really, really good for you in terms of the health benefits of that. Although I'd say carbs, if you eat carbohydrates that are more unprocessed carbohydrates, if you have whole grains and so on, they can be fine. But there's a danger that we fill up on carbohydrates, and they're not so nutritionally dense. So if we have too many carbohydrates, we don't get enough foods where you've got the real nutrient density. I think we have to be careful that we're eating food with vitamins, minerals, and with those amino acids that we need and those fatty acids that we need. Eat lower GI foods, and only eat when you're hungry. I think all of us get into habits of eating far too frequently. And there's evidence that eating within a restricted window is very good for you, because it allows your body to do the cleaning up and what's called the autophagy, which is getting rid of the damaged cells and so on. If you can reduce the window you're eating, so if you eat between 9 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock at night, that's good, and don't eat beyond those hours. But some people restrict even more, and that's even better in terms of the impact on the body of doing that. So I think I'm going to stop there. Yes, the last quote is Michael Pollan saying, "Don't eat anything your great grandmother wouldn't recognize as food." And I think that's probably pretty sound advice, to be honest.